Cyber Uncut. Discover the changing face of business, government and national security as Australia navigates the cyber revolution.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are listening to the Cyber Uncut podcast. My name is David Hollingworth and I am the Deputy Editor of Cyber Daily. And today on another special episode of the pod, we are chatting to Laura O'Neill, Head of Advisory and Assurance at Fujitsu. How are you, Laura?
I'm wonderful.
Now, we're very excited because you're joining us at the Australian Cyber Summit later this month and you're delivering a talk on decoding regulation. What's next for Australia's cyber policy framework? And I thought we might dive into that as a bit of a sneak peek of what people can see on the day. So I want to do a little crystal ball gazing. What's coming up in 2026 that your average CISO needs to be aware of in terms of changes to the regulatory landscape?
Yeah. I think I'll start with a few things that came out in 2025 that sort of will start impacting. And the first one, probably most notably, is mandatory ransomware reporting, which came out, I think, May last year. And sort of, I think there's a lot of organisations that aren't across how that applies to them, what they need to do, who they need to contact, and sort of working through that. The more interesting one that's coming up in 2026 isn't actually out of the security legislation, it's out of the Privacy Act. And the mandatory reporting and compliance with the privacy principles and changes in that are expected to, I think it's about 100,000 small businesses in Australia that previously weren't required to meet the Privacy Act requirements. But
this is the one that looks after like real estate agents and things like that. That caused a huge thing in the office because a lot of us are renters and we're like, at last, someone is aware of the reams of data we're handing over just to get a small two-bedder in Newtown.
And it's not actually coming in because of cybersecurity. It's coming in around requirements to do with anti-money laundering and various other things. But the implications to 100,000 small businesses now having to meet requirements for the Privacy Act is a huge change. Previously, most of them were exempt because they fell under the $3 million threshold. So I think we'll see a lot of organisations be impacted by that moving forward. But I think there's also just a lack of maturity across both, probably more so private sector, about the changes in legislation when they're coming up, what's happening next, the changes in standards that come off those legislations. The ISM updates every 6 months. A lot of organisations don't realise that, don't look at that, don't then reassess against it. So it is a big shifting landscape. I'm also interested to see around AI where we land because there's a union between cyber and AI. And the legislation on that is developing and to come in a time frame. But
it's a work in progress, Have you seen any pushback or commentary on that mandatory ransomware reporting?
I think there hasn't been pushback, and the government did industry consultation, which a lot of companies, including Fujitsu, sort of responded to. And I think one of the things that people sort of wanted to make clear, and I think in the end legislation sort of was there, was kind of, if we're reporting, are we then liable legally to be sued by people, etc. And the way the legislation, I think, ended up being shaped sort of means anything you report into Home Affairs and ACSC around this doesn't then, can't be used by them within any sort of future scenarios. But I do think the Cyber Incident Review Board, a lot of people are concerned about the publications that come out of that, then laying fault at companies and then subsequent legal issues sort of coming off that. But we will see. Because I don't think
it's quite new legislation. It's not properly been tested yet in that regards. Do you think organisations, as they stand, are unprepared for this movement from compliance to continuous accountability when it comes to cyber?
Yes, but I think we're also unprepared for compliance. We're sort of starting from, I think a lot of organisations struggle as is with compliance.
I think you're right.
Especially when you have any company that's been around for a while will have legacy infrastructure. It's very hard to retrofit cybersecurity controls into systems. It's also incredibly expensive to do cyber, to do compliance. So I think it's already a struggle, and then sort of moving to a model that's continuous cyber accountability, while good, just will increased the same problem set because a lot of organisations aren't there on compliance yet. And there's just not the focus that we would like to see. I think also the fact we still talk about compliance and not risk is a fundamental problem in the sector, because at the end of the day, any standard you look at is a generalised standard. It's not applicable to every organisation in the same way. My favourite example of this is healthcare. You look at a lot of the common standards we see, and they don't make sense for the functional operations of a hospital and a healthcare provider to be able to implement. And being compliant with those things would prevent emergency departments operating fully, etc. But then people talk about, well, they're not compliant. And it's like, we shouldn't be talking about compliance for standards that don't really apply to the business context of them. What's the actual risk of these things, I think, is kind of one of those things I always like to point out. And that covers a lot of sectors. It's not just healthcare. I think healthcare is just the most easy for people to understand why cybersecurity.
Yeah, that kind of feeds the next question. Like, I was going to ask about what the biggest disconnect between what regulators expect and what businesses are actually doing. I would say that healthcare example is a prime example right there, that you can't just do one regulatory framework fits all.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it is sort of the big disconnect. Like, you think about a lot of other regulation and it will apply to a specific sector. Cybersecurity regulation applies to every sector, and within those sectors you have very, very different use cases. I think also a lot of the regulation we've sort of seen, I do think a lot of the regulation's good, but you do need the grain of salt that these are generalised standards to apply to a majority of use cases across a variety of sectors, and that won't make sense for a number of organisations. Like, the sheer scale of what you're trying to cover with one piece of legislation is often where you come unstuck.
Yeah, and the scale of businesses is a problem there as well. I mean, we're talking from legislation that could apply to a large enterprise, which is nationwide, if not international, down to a smaller operator that may even be unaware that such legislation or compliance needs exist. So it seems to me that education then becomes an issue as well.
Yeah, I think education, but also just the funding. Like, we're expecting organisations to do more and more things around cybersecurity, which is fair and reasonable, but then we were expecting to do it within the same budgets they've always had. And in the public sector, that's a different conversation to the private sector. But I think often part of the problem set is cyber is the remit of IT, not an organisation-wide discussion. And I think that sort of builds into where we see people not understanding regulation because someone's like, oh, someone in IT will be dealing with it. It's like, no, but as the business owner for that particular system, you should know what your system's required to meet because you run the risk if something goes wrong. But I think that's also a big disconnect, and that sort of drives part of it as well.
Yeah, I was chatting to Graham Fairley from PEXA yesterday. He's joining us at the summit as well. And he was looking at this from the CISO angle. And I was asking him, like, what's the challenge of being a CISO and trying to tell the board that cyber isn't a cost center, it's a whole of business point of risk and opportunity. He just went, oh, you're not wrong.
CISO is the hardest
sigh.
C-suite job, right? Like, you're just telling people they need to spend money to prevent a potential situation going wrong. You never have good news to deliver because it's that or coming and telling them something's gone wrong, right? Like, you're just the bad guy in every room as a CISO.
We need to spend money, and if we didn't, well, now bad things have happened, or we spent money and a bad thing happened anyway. Yeah, there's no good outcomes there. You couldn't pay me to be a CISO for quids. On that, we're going to go for a short break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Cyber Uncut. My name's David Hollingworth. I'm joined by Laura O'Neill, Head of Advisory and Assurance at Fujitsu. I want to talk critical infrastructure for a bit and how the definition of CI and material risk involved with that is evolving under this new legislation. How is that moving along?
Yeah, so the big shift is sort of away from just talking about physical assets and to talking about data storage and supply chain of critical infrastructure. And I think supply chain in particular is one of those areas that people don't fully understand. They will often be like, hey, our business is secure, and not think through the 60 suppliers they have, some of which have access to their network, have connected systems. I think for a lot of organisations as well, knowing whether they're considered critical infrastructure in certain sectors is not really clear.
That'd be a wild one. I can't imagine like you're going about your daily business. You think your job is X. Something happens and someone calls up from the government, by the way, your critical infrastructure, why didn't you behave so? And you're like, we are?
Yeah. Like we've had working in consulting for cybersecurity. We've had a lot of clients call up and be like, can you assess whether we actually are considered critical infrastructure now because we're part of the supply chain to this dam or whatever it is.
Or a massive logistics and shipping company or something like that.
And I think a lot of what in the supply chain is then falls under the regulation. How do organisations know? What do they push down in the regulation to parts of their supply chain, what they can't? That's sort of, I'm going to say, the harder part of the changes to the critical infrastructure. And I think that will get worked out sector by sector, but I think it has huge implications. And also, like, it's a shifting landscape globally around supply chain in general for businesses at the moment, where we get things from what's considered risky countries versus not. It's a shifting landscape. So I think that's also going to add a lot of complexity to this about supply chains that we once thought were secure and reliable may not be moving forward, and there's a much bigger focus on that.
And now we're seeing a huge focus on code repositories as a supply chain issue. So it's no longer this is the company we get this hardware from and we share some customer data with and there's risk, but now the company we get code from isn't even a physical product. It can be dangerous. So that supply chain is now getting broader and more porous every time, isn't it? So some of Fujitsu's research has recently highlighted that a lot of companies have weak post-intrusion resilience. Are regulations finally starting to reflect that reality, that incident response is hard?
I think so. So the stats that you're talking about is we have a red team capability that spans Japan and Australia and other parts of sort of the Asia Pacific. And they've been doing red team exercises on some quite large organisations. And in 70% of those organisations, they achieved domain admin within the first day. And in only 10% of those organisations did the organisation actually have alerting that said, hey, something's going on, and it was identified. And that seems bad. And like our red team is excellent, but they're not different to the rest of the industry. It's something that I've seen across various companies over time. I think it's a long time coming for people to realise that you can't prevent every attack. A lot of people want to be 100% compliant and have zero risk and, we will never get compromised. That's not achievable. That's not viable. Systems are too fast. Security costs too much to across everything. The real question is, how do you recover? And are you ready for downtime? I think a statistic that's not actually from Fujitsu but came out in the last day or two from one of the global cyber trend reports, and it had a number of Australian companies sort of involved in it, was 73% of the Australian companies that they surveyed were losing $700,000 an hour in incidents when they had to shut down systems because they couldn't provide services, they weren't generating revenue, as well as the cost of actually recovering from it. And then about 11% were over $1 million an hour it was costing them. So I think people everyone wants to believe that they won't get attacked, but the statistics actually tell you, like...
The first thing that got hammered into me when I started in this business from everyone I spoke to is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and plan appropriately.
So the real question is, how do you respond at the time? And I think some of the regulations sort of shifting to provide better frameworks and a better focus on that. But I think one of the areas a lot of people sort of don't think through heavily, although it's in the Essential 8, is around backups. Do you have the backups so you can recreate your system somewhere else with the data and go back to operations fast? Because we are just getting to the point where attacks evolve faster than we evolve defences, let alone implement them.
Weeks down to days, down to hours, down to minutes in some cases now.
So the how do you recover and what do you do when something goes wrong is ever more important, I think.
And we've seen instances now, especially last year, of big companies like Jaguar Land Rover being the poster child for it. Their production lines go offline for so long that the GDP of the UK drops. And you wouldn't even consider JLR to be critical infrastructure. However... kind of feels like it if the GDP
Yeah.
of the country is dropping. So that's just kind of wild. Mind you, I don't know how you back up an entire production line. I guess you just have a spare factory lying around somewhere.
I don't know in that case. I don't do heaps in manufacturing, unfortunately.
that's
I'm
a
sure
hard
someone
one.
has a good idea about that.
But yeah, keeping those backups secure. So not only can you get access to them easily, but also so the bad guys can't get to them and screw them over. Because if they can, then what use is a backup?
We actually have a lot of clients where they're like, we backed everything up and then the backup is actually connected to the main system they're backing up. And we've had to gently explain that it's good you've done backups, but if someone can compromise and get domain admin to your primary system, your backups
Will be
connected
encrypted
to it.
along with the rest of your data.
Exactly. So the actual logistics of how you do it, it's more than just backing it up.
Yeah.
It's where you store it and various other things.
Yeah. Do you think regulation can realistically keep pace with, and this is particularly prevalent now, this question was actually written before Project Glasswing really came into being. Yeah. Do you think regulation can realistically keep up pace with AI-driven attacks, or are we just in a reactive cycle now?
We're in a reactive cycle, but we always have been in cyber. I don't think that's new. I think the time to react is, it's longer for us to react and identify what's going on. So the time frame between offensive capability versus the defensive is getting longer, and that exposes more people. I also think people are sort of thinking about it as, oh, they'll just come up with new attack vectors and that's the only thing that changes. But I think there's huge implications to AI that we sort of haven't seen play out yet around evolution of things that have been let into the wild, shall we say, moving through organisations. So there's a lot of organisations that traditionally haven't been targeted by cyber criminals and things because of ethical or moral constraints that a lot of actors have, where they're like, hey, I'm not going to go after a charity, I'm not going to go after a hospital, whatever it is. As we move to sort of an era of we've created AI that's sent to target various organisations with the you need to compromise as many as possible, you lose the human factor that probably protected a lot of organisations in those sort of areas.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see increases in some sort of sectors where we traditionally haven't seen a lot of attacks because of the moral and ethical constraints of having a human still in control that we sort of lose.
I hate to think of a world where we are currently relying upon the moral and ethical constraints of ransomware operators.
Some of them have very clear ethos.
You
they
are
write
right.
up
I've seen them.
about,
Here are things we do not attack. One, we don't attack anyone in Russia. Okay, well, that says a lot. But two, we don't go after hospitals. We don't go after schools. We don't go after charities. Now, it's not all of them. And some of them have changed over time since I've been covering this. But you are right that it seems a thin thing to rely upon, but it's there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also just a very costly exercise. I think we will see AI-enabled cyber defenses, but we're always going to be playing such a game of catch-up. And we always have been. I think it goes back to my previous point, right? The real question is, can you recover? And can you identify it's happened? Because it's going to cost you so much money. And in some cases, some organisations have huge amounts of money to spend on security. A lot of organisations don't. Backing up is a lot cheaper, and assuming it will get compromised might be the best option for certain organisations.
Yeah. On that note, we're going to take another short break. We'll be right back with one last segment. Welcome back to Cyber Uncut. Thank you again for joining us, Laura. One last question. I want to talk about the positive side of regulatory pressures here and how organizations can use those pressures as a catalyst to improve cyber resilience rather than just making compliance a box to tick. What's the positive power of having all of this?
I think you can use regulatory pressure as sort of a forcing function in your organisation to sort of have a strategic conversation with your board instead of just talking about compliance obligations. And I think it's where a lot of organisations are stuck at the moment. I think changes in legislation sort of set the condition to talk to the board about risk, about funding, about how do we prioritise cyber in a way it traditionally isn't, because everyone just reports up compliance and that's all anyone cares about. So I think sort of for CISOs, CSOs, whoever's briefing the board, sort of changing the conversation from what do we need to do to comply to what level of risk do we carry? how are we going to, what are we going to accept risk-wise? What are we going to try and reduce the risk from? And then sort of the funding, the prioritization of that. Because I think one of the areas like cyber as a sector has struggled is traditionally cyber silos itself out within an organization and says cyber is in this little fort over here and we do things our way. And, you know,
defense mindset.
Yeah, very much. But we aren't part of the broader business and we're above that. But it should be a business conversation because every member of the board, and I think we've seen AICD release the cybersecurity principles for boards 2 years ago when they updated late last year. ACSC actually came out with something with AICD in the last few weeks around board level guidance. I think boards are now more open to the discussion. But you actually have to get up there and have the discussion. And we have a number of clients where we sort of went with them to do their board briefings as sort of an independent and external provider and sort of talk them through what's going on in the industry. And the difference that makes when you've changed the conversation from just are we compliant to what is the risk and what do we need to care about in terms of funding that they will endorse, strategic priorities and where that will sit. So I think, the shift in regulation, while hard, is a great opportunity to sort of go and change the conversation with the powers that be beyond cyber that actually spend the money and have the decision-making rights that can change the course of what you get to do.
And from that CISO angle, it seems to me one of the best ways to have that conversation with the board is start talking about minimum viable business. Like, what do we need to be able to keep ticking over and working out what that is? So that's what we need to protect. And then what's your appetite for risk? What are you prepared to lose? And then suddenly you combine compliance and regulation into that, you end up with something that's pretty much the whole picture. What are some of the big challenges you see when boards say they don't want to go down that route?
I think the biggest challenge I've run into a few times with clients is boards saying we want zero cyber risk, which is a fascinating position to take.
Putting my CISO hat on, I'm like, oh no.
Right. And I think that sort of attitude, and sometimes it's not just at the board level, it permeates through the C-suite across various roles, is often driven by people, the fear of the unknown and what could happen. But what that does is it then drives behaviour within the cyber teams, I would say, to creatively drive results. And what you often see is, they'll be told they can have zero risk and they must be fully compliant. So instead of, and they're not given more money to do it. So then what they'll go do is they'll run their annual audit and they'll scope it down to a very small subset of things they know they've patched and are all good. And then they'll be look at our great results. So people end up hiding the problem, I think. And the challenge there is about the education piece. Again, I think it's changing. I think there's a lot more discussion at the board level that's mature and is understanding of, like any domain within risk, cyber runs risk. If you run a system, you run risk, right? It's what level of risk are you comfortable with?
But having seen the scale some of these hackers will target, like it's a small operation out of someone's lounge room in their home and hackers will still go after it. They'll go after that. They'll go after anything.
So I think that's one of those things where we will get there, but it is probably the most difficult thing to overcome at a board level if you've got a board that wants zero cyber risk and 100% compliance, because it's an unachievable goal.
I was just going to say, and on that note, let's just say there is no such thing as zero cyber. There's very much cyber, and why we're doing events like the Australian Cyber Summit, having conversations like this, thank you, Laura, is to try and get people and educate people that cyber risk is real and needs to be addressed, and by addressing it now, it is far better than doing it once the incident's happened. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody watching and listening, you can see more of Laura and myself at the Australian Cyber Summit coming up on April 30 in Sydney. If you go to cyberdaily.au/Australian Cyber Summit, you can buy tickets, sign up, see who else is on the agenda. I'm doing a couple of panels. And we hope to see you there. Laura, thanks again.
Thank you.